because this is part of your book, which
Yeah.
will come to what went wrong with capitalism. Essentially, one of your thesis is that there is this huge concentration of wealth at the moment, and this is across the world, not
Yes.
just in India. However, as recent reports suggest, 5% of Indians account for 60% of the national wealth. Do you believe this is, in a sense, the biggest challenge for any government? Whoever comes to power on June 4th, this is going to be their big challenge. How are you going to reduce inequalities and soften and cushion those at the bottom of the pyramid without resorting to the kind of large welfare measures that most governments do?
Yeah, no, but I think that in India's case, it's a bit more complex than that because the governments have always done a lot of welfare. In fact, if you look at India's growth model compared to China's, China followed ruthless capitalism. They gave no welfare to their people until, their per capita income was very high. China did that. We have never followed that ruthless capitalism. In fact, I begin my book by saying that it's really, like the fact that in America today, most youngsters there, they feel that socialism is a better model than capitalism. They have lost their faith in capitalism. And I begin the book by saying that, listen, I grew up in a socialist India of the 1980s. I know how bad that is. So there's no going back to that in terms of that. But I think that what we do know is that as I make the point in the book, that often government actions lead to greater perverse outcomes. And in India's case, as I've said, that the role of the government often has been to intervene to almost, or across the world, to accentuate inequality with the measures by supporting. Very important part about reform we should understand. Capitalism is about being pro-competition. It's not about being pro-business. It's a very important distinction people don't realize, that a lot of policymakers and government end up being pro-business. That's not capitalism. Capitalism is being pro-competition, pro-churn, for new people to rise, not for the old entrenched elite to stick on to power.
But if we talk about economic anxieties in India, how does that translate, you believe, into political preferences? Because one of the more fascinating aspects in a year where several democracies are going through elections, the United States is going through a period of economic prosperity, a real boom, most economic indices better than ever before, and yet the general impression is the incumbent president, Joe Biden, is most likely to lose.
Yeah.
Now, put that in the Indian context. India has been seen post-COVID to emerge as one of the stronger economies in the world. Does that make it easier to predict a re-election for Prime Minister Modi, as some would suggest? Or is there no correlation between economic anxieties and political preferences?
Broadly, in India's case, the data that I've done on this shows the following conclusion. So I did this data for my last book, in fact, Democracy on the Road. What it showed was that if you look at India, there have been 30 instances when a chief minister has presided over an economic growth rate of over 8%. 30 instances. In half of those instances, the chief minister lost their re-election. This never happens anywhere in the world. 8% economic growth over 5 years, half of the chief ministers lost the election.
Including Vajpayee in 2004.
Yeah, and
Atal Bihari Vajpayee lost when the economy was on a high. Chandrababu Naidu lost
even
Andhra
now,
Pradesh.
Even Andhra Pradesh, I think there's an emerging consensus currently, which is that Jagan may well lose this election, even though Andhra Pradesh has done relatively well. It's been more pro-welfare, but has done relatively well. So in India's case, elections are much more complex than having a straight link between economics and politics. So I think that's link between economics and politics. Yeah, it's there. In India's case, I do believe that I know exactly what can lose you elections, which is high inflation. The moment you have high inflation, any country in the world, even one of Biden's problem has been high inflation. The credit I'll give to the Modi government is the fact that even though they keep, there's a lot of talk about high food prices and all that, generally inflation has been relatively well behaved. And one of the good things they did was that when you had this pandemic, they did not go wild with stimulus. A lot of countries around the world went wild with stimulus, which is what led to a massive inflation problem. India didn't do that. So generally inflation has been better. And I think that anti-incumbency would have been much greater had inflation been galloping at 8 or 9% rather than the 5%. But I think, as was pointed out earlier, inflation and rising food prices will always be cited in India because so many people are living at the margin they'll always cite it as a factor when you do the polls.
So broadly, you're saying Mehengai is a more difficult problem for politicians, incumbents to handle than growth. You can grow at 8%
Yeah.
and still lose an election.
Yes.
But if inflation was 8%, you'd be in serious
You definitely lose in the election. I think that's what lost Narasimha Rao in 96. I think that we know it, like that onions make politicians cry, literally, right? Every election. So that's, yeah.
Let's talk about the cult of Mr. Modi for a moment, because you mentioned it in Democracy on the Road as well. Across the world, we are seeing the rise of the strongman politician. Do you believe that this rise of the strongman politician is here to stay? That those are the politicians whom people are able to identify with. And therefore, as Indian elections possibly get more presidential, the strongman leader has an advantage over someone else who may be more democratic in his or her functioning, but is not seen as that muscular strongman.
Again, I think that there is a certain sliver of India's urban middle class, and something again I wrote about, which is willing to make a trade-off, which is willing to say, hey, as long as I'm doing well, I'm willing to make a trade-off between the economy and democracy. There is a certain sliver of that urban middle class which feels that way. So that's what feeds into it. But again, the travels this time revealed that if you speak to the average person, they're not thinking in these intellectual terms. They're thinking about what is in it for me. It's very transactional.
They're not thinking about Samvidhan Khatre mein hai.
I mean, in terms of the fact that I didn't get that sense, that it's a very daily existential crisis is what I feel. It's not about thinking these intellectual debates which we love having out here. That's the feeling I got.